I'm a huge fan of comic books, but when it comes to manga, I am probably less than a novice. I read a lot when I was a kid. Dragon Ball, I could not get enough of it. But oddly, when I got to college, manga was something that kind of fell away. And because it was so massive, I never really knew what my area of entry should be. Sure, I would read some here or there. Maybe I'd walk by the library, look at the gigantic stack you'd find in the youth section and go, all right, I think I'll pick this. It looks cool. But because a lot of stuff is multi-volume and it would sometimes be tough to find the number one, it was not something that I actively explored. And of course, it was so popular that I was too cool for that. Oh yeah, other people can enjoy manga. Let me go enjoy my, I don't know, Spider-Man. Recently, I got into manga because one of the podcasts I listened to had a very enthusiastic episode about One Piece. So I went out and right when the pandemic started, I bought one of those gigantic treasure chests that had like 20 plus volumes of One Piece in it, and I completely devoured it. Unfortunately, I cannot really continue reading it physically because One Piece, the second box set, is impossible to get right now. It is driving me mad! And we will return to the impossible to get the physical copies of the books later on in this little video. After that, I started exploring. I asked on Twitter what people would recommend, which are some of the titles that I'm going to discuss here, and I also got into Osamu Tezuka, the god of manga, and I read a bunch of his books and just absolutely loved it. I want to read as much as I can by him. So this video series, if you are a massive manga fan, you love everything about it, please don't watch this. This is for people like me who don't really know that much and maybe want a few recommendations here or there. I'm not going to be recommending, at least in this one, anything that is super rare. It is accessible. If you're in Canada, you can go to an Indigo and pick it up, or actually go to your local comic book shop because they'll probably have it as well. Also, the manga that I'm going to be talking about today is mostly all action-oriented manga because I really wanted to go in and go to the base instincts of stuff. And these are some of the things that people recommended when I did that Twitter thread, and the titles would just pop out at me and it kind of drilled into my mind. I have a big list on my phone, and when I go into stores, I go, do they have any of these? What's surprising is that manga, because there's so much of it, a lot of it is just unavailable at this time. If you missed it out when it was published in the early 2000s, or a particular title, then it's completely gone. And I am someone who really likes to read things physically. I find that my attention is more easily focused when I am holding a book in my hand. I know that a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today is available if you just go to Amazon. It's on Kindle, maybe it's on Comixology, maybe it's on Crunchyroll or even Viz. But for me, when I talk about some of the frustrations about getting these books, it's just because I like holding them in my hand. I found over the years that when I read comic books online, especially like long runs, it kind of just fades out of my memory. It's weird. I don't know why. Maybe it's because there's so many more different variables that go into reading a book, me having to find the book, where I was sitting when I read the book, how long it took me to read the book, that when I just sit on my computer and I absorb it, especially if it's a long run, I just click as much as I can, it kind of just falls away. After I finished reading those One Piece mangas, I actually went online because I'm like, I gotta read more, and I started reading, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't the same as holding the book in my hand. Now, I understand that a lot of people, you can't afford to buy manga. It's so expensive. So a lot of the stuff that I'm going to recommend, just go online if it's accessible and you can read it. So let us begin with a manga that was recommended in that original thread called Dorohedoro. Now, I'm going to mispronounce a lot of these books when I talk about them. So Dorohedoro is a manga that was described as wild and wacky and hyper-violent. It was released in the early 2000s. It's already completed its run, which is 20 plus volumes. And if you want to get into this kind of stuff, I think this is a good place to start. It's definitely manga-ish, having all of the kind of stylistic conceits to it, but it's also reminiscent of stuff like Simon Bisley and almost heavy metal style comics, and it's very straightforward in its presentation. It's about a giant lizard man who is going around killing people with his woman sidekick and friend because he's trying to figure out who he is, why he has a giant lizard head, and there's also sorcerers and it's a world of magic, but not a fantasy one. It's kind of like post-apocalyptic. It is fun. The action scenes are great in it. It is kind of sketchily drawn, and it's just amusing to hang out with these characters. It goes down easy. Some of the other mangas that I'll talk about today, I found a little bit of difficulty because of the pacing of them. And this one, each chapter is very easily digestible. And you don't get that frustrated feeling of like, okay, when is something going to happen? All right, I got to go to the next chapter. And this one is also very easily accessible in terms of going to an Indigo and picking it up. I recently picked it up at Page and Panel in Toronto, which is the TCAF bookstore at the Toronto Reference Library. They had a massive collection of them, and I feel like this is one of those that keeps being put back in stock. Next up, we have one a little bit off the beaten path, and it is Die Wer, oh boy, I'm going to mutilate this, Gelder? And that's German. And so this is not an easy title to remember when you go to the bookstore and you go like, which one was it? And this one caught my attention when I was at BMV. It was up in their manga section and it was wrapped. And when you get a wrapped book, that means, oh boy, it's probably a little violent. Actually, it probably just means that it's sexual, and that's why they're wrapping it so kids can't pick it up off the shelf and just start reading. This one caught my attention because it is from the guy who did Blade of the Immortal, a manga that I have a little bit of familiarity with because it's one of those big ones like Berserk, where you always see it when you go to the store and it's been printed a million different ways. And this one on the back, it sold it as kind of, it's like female Scorpion, Japanese style exploitation films with a lot of action. And I'm like, ooh, I'm a guy that likes action. I should check this out, especially the thickness of it. I'm the kind of person that when I see something that's like big and thick, instead of going, oh, that's too long, I'm like, I want to get into it. Right now I'm holding volume 2 in my hands. Actually, I have volume 1 and 2. I bought them together because when it comes to manga, I like to get the first 2 volumes, if it's possible, when I'm getting into it, because sometimes the first volume, the artist is figuring themselves out. They're trying to figure out what direction they want to go into. And then the second volume, you get like, okay, now all the pieces are clicking together and it's super fun. And that's basically what happened with this book. It is very slow-paced, and it's one that at first I didn't even quite know what was going on. It was promised as a story of revenge, and while it started with a bunch of violence, a bunch of uncomfortable sexual stuff that usually goes with these kind of exploitation films, I didn't even know who the main character was, and it kept jumping through time, and eventually things kind of came together by halfway in the book when you get the first big action scene. And what's good about this kind of stuff, especially manga when it comes to action, is that they often have time to just make things play. If you are in a week-by-week system, especially when stuff like One Piece, action scenes could go on for years. Now, as far as I can tell, this one is interesting because it was published in a quarterly magazine, and I cannot imagine having to read it in that form because it is all over the place. Like, I didn't quite know what was going on, and finally when the big action scene broke out, I'm like, oh, okay, these characters coming together, now it's making a little bit more sense, even though I'm not quite sure of their goals from chapter to chapter. This manga artist is incredible when it comes to cinematic stuff. He has a sketchy style, kind of like the first book that I talked about. I mean, Blade of the Immortal is probably the place that you want to start, and then you go on to this for his more wilder side. What I was impressed by is that some of the threads that were starting in the first one, like this really weird stuff, he figured out along the way, okay, this is how I'm going to connect it together. So with this one, you get a kind of slower pace, very cinematic, but it is definitely reminiscent of those kind of Japanese exploitation films that were coming up around the 70s. That kind of, oh man, I can't believe they did that, paired with amazing action sequences. There's not a lot in this book, but they are very long and there's tons of gags, including a gun gag in the second volume that I have never seen before, and maybe I will steal at some point. There is supposed to be a third volume, and it has not come out yet, even though it is up for pre-order, and I think it's coming out later in the year. And I think it may be wrapping it up. I'm not quite sure. I couldn't find that much information about this. I've actually been listening to a podcast called Manga-splaining, which is kind of like a spin-off of The Beguiling, an amazing comic book store in Toronto. And that has been a great place to get recommendations and just discussions about manga and history lessons as well. It's an overwhelming topic, but that podcast is great because the main subject of it, Chip Zdarsky, knows nothing about manga, and so he's being introduced to it through the 3 very knowledgeable hosts. So if you want more manga context, I would definitely recommend checking out the Manga-splaining podcast, who are somehow not the sponsor of this video. And finally, I would like to recommend Golden Kamuy, which is a manga that was recommended when I asked what Western mangas should I check out. And by Western, I mean not in the style, Western style, but in like cowboys and Indians and that kind of feel. And while Golden Kamuy is not like that, it actually takes place after the Russo-Japanese War in Hokkaido, which is a snowy region of Japan. It definitely has that kind of Canadian set Western, and I really like it, even though that it is very specific in where it's set. This is another one, just like the first book that I mentioned, that is very popular. There's a anime about it. It's been around for decades, but I'm only getting to it now. I'm like the guy who is stopping you at a party and saying, wow, have you heard of this Beatles band? They're really good. So Golden Kamuy is a quest manga. It's about a soldier who is looking for a treasure map that is tattooed on a bunch of people's skin. And in the process of looking for it, he teams up with an Ainu girl who are indigenous in that area of Japan, and they just fight a bunch of different people in incredibly gory ways. The last two mangas that I recommended have kind of sketchy / detailed artwork that are all about kind of like flow versus the realism or crispness. And this manga is very crisp. Now, there's still speed lines and stuff like that, but everybody is almost detailed in a way that pops off the page, which I didn't expect, especially when the action scenes are as gory as they are in this book. Within a couple pages, just guts are spilling out of some characters. I found this super fun, especially that I've heard this described as an explainer manga as well, in the sense that it is, you know, an adventure quest style of manga, but you also have a lot of descriptions of the indigenous people, the tools that they would use in the forests, and how you would make certain recipes in a way that personally I didn't really find slowed down the narrative. I found all the stuff interesting. I didn't know about any of it. And then when you couple that with just great action scenes, amazing art, I mean, it's an easy recommendation. It is wrapping up, if it's not already done, at 27 volumes, and I only have the first two right now, and I will definitely be continuing to check it out. Like the first book, this one is published by Viz Media, so it's very accessible. They are a massive manga publisher, and you could pick it up without much problem. You could probably even get it from the library. Now, when I was mentioning about problems with getting books like this, there has been a paper shortage in the world thanks to the great pandemic that's going on. So for some baffling reason, volume 3 of this book is very hard to get. I couldn't find it in any stores. And if you look online right now, well, at least at Amazon.ca, it is $129. I am certain it will be getting back in print, but these are the kind of frustrations that I'm like, ah, man, I want to keep reading this, but it's a little bit difficult if I can't get the next part, and I'm not skipping to volume 4. What am I, some kind of madman? I'll be completely lost. So I hope you enjoyed this video of me just describing some of the new manga that I recently started reading and enjoying. And if you like this, or you have any manga you recommend that I should check out, as long as it's easily available, bonus points if it's in a physical format. And if you enjoyed this, make sure to subscribe. I have tons of more videos like this, film recommendation videos, book recommendation videos. The Film Trap is a very global thing. So I'll see you in the next one.